By sunrise, the auction yard outside Ashland, Nebraska already looked defeated. Rain from the previous night had turned the gravel lanes into black mud, and every row of equipment carried the dull gray shine of cold November moisture. Farmers moved slowly between rusted combines, broken hay balers, and dented grain trucks with their hands buried in coat pockets against the wind. Diesel fumes drifted low across the property while the auctioneer's speakers crackled through static that the weather never seemed to spare. Tow operators had gathered near the heavier equipment row where 3 retired wreckers sat side by side like dead animals left beside a highway. 2 of them drew attention immediately. One was a bright red hydraulic rig from the 70s. The other was a newer diesel rollback with a seized transmission but clean body panels. Men circled both trucks discussing parts value and resale numbers. Nobody looked twice at the Holmes wrecker parked behind them. The truck was a 1953 Chevrolet with faded blue paint worn nearly white along the doors and hood. Rust had eaten through both rear fenders. The passenger window was missing entirely, covered instead with cardboard held in place by silver tape gone brittle with age. But the strangest thing about the truck sat underneath it. Heavy weld seams ran along the frame rails from front axle to rear boom mount, thick uneven welds done decades earlier by somebody who cared more about strength than appearance. The welds caught the attention of only one man in the yard. He stood quietly near the back fence while the auctioneer worked through a line of grain trailers. Mid-40s, lean, wearing an oil-stained canvas jacket, he crouched beside the wrecker long enough to brush mud away from the steel with his glove. Then he nodded once to himself and stayed there until bidding started. $200, the auctioneer called. Silence. $250. The mechanic raised one hand. From beside the newer rollback, local tow dealer Carl Braddock laughed loud enough for half the yard to hear. That thing's worth more as scrap iron than as a tow truck. A few men grinned. The mechanic never looked at him. $280, the auctioneer said. Sold. Carl shook his head slowly. Man just bought himself 30 years of problems. Behind them, the old Holmes sat silent beneath freezing wind and circling November crows. By modern towing standards, the Holmes wrecker was obsolete before most of the men at the auction were born. The original mechanical boom assembly dated back to an era when recovery trucks relied on gear reduction, cable tension, and raw chassis weight instead of hydraulics and computerized load systems. Every visible part of the truck showed its age. The rear leaf springs were cracked near the mounting brackets, one badly enough that daylight showed through the steel when the suspension flexed. The PTO shaft that transferred engine power to the winch assembly had seized completely from years of sitting exposed to moisture. Rust covered the universal joints in thick orange scale, and one of the grease fittings had snapped off decades earlier. The truck's rear axle made even less sense. The front axle belonged to a Chevrolet medium-duty chassis, but the rear differential had clearly come from something heavier, possibly an old military transport or oilfield hauler. The wheel spacing did not match factory measurements, and the frame rails carried dozens of thick weld scars where reinforcement plates had once been added, removed, then added again. Some welds looked rough enough to concern any modern inspector. Others looked strangely precise, deep-beat industrial work done by someone who understood stress loads far beyond ordinary farm repair. To Carl Braddock, none of that mattered. Carl owned the largest tow service within 60 miles, and had spent years replacing old cable wreckers with modern hydraulic recovery rigs. His newest truck could lift 20 tons with computerized boom stabilization and remote winch controls operated from inside the cab. Men like Carl saw old wreckers the same way airlines saw propeller aircraft, outdated machines from a slower and less efficient time. Mechanical cable systems had disappeared for a reason. They were dangerous, labor-intensive, and required operators who understood balance, leverage, and pull angles instinctively. Hydraulic systems simplified everything. More power, faster operation, less skill required. Standing beside the auction trailer after the sale, Carl watched the mechanic studying the Holmes again and shook his head. Frames butchered, PTO's dead, springs are shot. That truck ain't a recovery rig anymore. He spat into the mud beside his boot. It's just 3 tons of scrap steel with headlights. The mechanic's name was Walter Grinnell, though most people around Saunders County simply called him Walt. He operated a small repair shop 20 miles south of Ashland on a gravel road surrounded by soybean fields and abandoned irrigation equipment. The building had once been a machine shed before Walt converted it into a workshop filled with broken tractor housings, oilfield pumps, cracked combined gearboxes, and welding equipment older than most dealerships in Nebraska. For nearly 20 years, farmers brought him machinery nobody else wanted to repair. Walt had rebuilt seized diesel engines after dealership mechanics declared them worthless. He repaired cracked transmission housings with nickel rod welds that held another decade. Oil companies occasionally hired him to salvage abandoned drilling equipment because he understood old steel, old load systems, and old machinery built during an era when components were massively over-engineered. That was why he cared about the frame underneath the Holmes wrecker. While everyone else looked at rust, Walt looked at geometry. The weld seams running along the frame rails were not random farm repairs. He saw boxed reinforcement sections hidden beneath layers of grease and oxidized steel. Somebody had widened the stress distribution points near the rear boom supports decades earlier. Additional crossmembers had been added underneath the chassis in a pattern that reminded Walt of heavy oilfield recovery trucks from the 50s. That made no sense on a small Holmes wrecker. He crouched lower in the mud, brushing away dirt near the rear axle housing. There it was again. More reinforcement plating. Thick steel, industrial-grade weld penetration. Whoever modified this truck had not been patching weakness. They had been preparing the chassis to survive loads far heavier than the original factory rating. Walt stood slowly without saying a word. Around him, the auction continued through rusted tractors and livestock trailers while men laughed about the old wrecker sitting in the back row. Walt ignored them. He kept replaying the same question in his mind. Why would somebody spend that kind of effort strengthening a 1953 recovery truck? As the crowd moved toward the next equipment line, Walt glanced once more beneath the frame rail and noticed something else almost completely hidden under 60 years of grime. A section of steel plate had been welded shut deliberately, not repaired, sealed. By noon, most of the auction crowd had migrated to the Prairie View Co-op Cafe 2 miles east of town. Wet boots tracked mud across the tile floor while farmers crowded into booths beneath yellowed fluorescent lights that hummed constantly above the tables. The smell of coffee, diesel jackets, and fried onions filled the room the way it always did after county auctions. Carl Braddock made sure everybody heard about the Holmes wrecker. He sat near the center booth with 3 other tow operators, replaying the purchase louder each time new customers walked inside. $280, he said again, shaking his head dramatically. For a truck that ain't hauled anything since Eisenhower. Laughter rolled through the cafe. One farmer stirred cream into his coffee and added, "That thing belongs in a fence row with the rest of the scrap." Another man grinned. "Hell, the tire's probably worth more than the truck." Carl leaned back against the booth seat, enjoying the attention. You know what the funny part is? Walt actually crawled underneath it like he was inspecting some rare machine. More laughter. Only rare thing about that wreck is how completely worn out it is. Near the back counter, Walt sat alone with coffee and eggs untouched in front of him. He listened without reacting. That was normal for him. Men who worked around machinery long enough learned there was no value arguing with noise. Carl finally raised his voice toward him. "So tell us, Walt, what exactly did you buy out there today?" The cafe quieted slightly. Walt folded his napkin once before answering. "Depends what's under it." Several men exchanged confused looks. Carl laughed immediately. "Under it? I already told you what's under it. Rust, cracked steel, and bad decisions." But Walt only looked out the cafe window toward the gray Nebraska sky. He was remembering the weld patterns beneath the frame, the hidden reinforcement plates, the sealed steel compartment welded shut so carefully that most people would never notice it existed at all. Somewhere in that truck was a reason somebody spent enormous time and money rebuilding a worthless old wrecker. And men did not invest that kind of work into machines unless the machine once did something important. The first real cleaning started under the frame rails, where years of hardened grease had sealed the steel like tar. Walt used a wire brush and solvent, working slowly because old industrial grease hides more than dirt. It hides modifications. Within an hour, the outer grime began to peel away, revealing layered steelwork beneath the factory frame. And that was when he saw it, the first internal reinforcement plate, not bolted on, but welded inside the rail cavity. Most factory frames are open-channel steel, but this one had been boxed from the inside using heavy oilfield-grade plate. The welds were not agricultural repairs, they were continuous bead seams designed to distribute torsional load across the chassis. He followed the reinforcement line forward and found additional cross members inserted between the original factory supports. These were not random additions, they matched the geometry of oilfield recovery rigs used to pull overturned drilling equipment. Walt paused when he noticed a sealed section of frame rail that had been fully closed with overlapping weld passes. He cut a small inspection opening, careful not to weaken the structure, and shone a light inside the cavity. What he saw made the entire frame geometry click into place like a solved equation. Inside the rail was a second hidden spine of steel, running the full length of the chassis. This was not a repair job, it was a complete structural transformation done sometime in the 1960s. Walt stepped back slowly, realizing the truck had been engineered to survive loads far beyond its original design. This was not a wrecker built for cars. It had once been a heavy oilfield recovery machine disguised as one. The realization changed everything he thought he was looking at. He wasn't standing in front of a worthless auction purchase. He was standing in front of a purpose-built recovery platform from another era of industrial engineering. And for the first time, the silence around the truck felt completely justified. Whatever this machine was originally built to do, It had been reinforced, modified, and re-engineered by people who clearly understood extreme load physics, muddy terrain extraction, and the violent stress of pulling overturned drilling rigs from unstable ground. Not scrap, not junk, but forgotten engineering built for recovery work that no longer existed in modern towing records, only hidden in plain steel still perfectly intact. Spring rain arrived earlier than anyone in Saunders County had planned for. It came in slow, heavy waves that turned the frozen ground into soft, unstable clay within days. Irrigation fields filled, drainage ditches overflowed, and every gravel road outside town carried the same warning. Weight was no longer an advantage, it was a liability. That was when the grain truck went off the road. It happened just outside a soybean field on the south edge of the county line. A fully loaded semi-hauling winter wheat had tried to ease onto a narrow irrigation crossing when the rear wheels broke through the softened shoulder. In less than 10 seconds, the truck slid sideways into the ditch and settled at an angle that made recovery dangerous before anyone even arrived. 2 modern wreckers showed up first. Both were heavy hydraulic units, bright paint still clean, outfitted with computerized stabilizers and extended boom arms. The operators did what they were trained to do. They deployed outriggers, tested ground compression, and immediately realized the problem. The soil could not support full load transfer. Every time they extended pressure through the boom, the outriggers began to sink. Within an hour, the situation had not improved. The grain truck was stuck deeper. The ground around it was collapsing in slow motion. Even experienced operators stepped back and shook their heads. One of them muttered that they would need mats. Another suggested waiting for ground freeze again. But everyone knew what that meant. Delay, cost, risk. That was when Walt arrived. The old Holmes wrecker rolled in behind a dusty pickup, its faded frame still showing uneven weld lines beneath the mud. At first, nobody reacted. Then someone laughed. Not loudly at first, but enough to spread. That's what he brought, one of the younger tow operators said. That relic. Carl Braddock, who had come to supervise the recovery, crossed his arms and shook his head. He's going to sink that thing before it even touches the cable. Walt didn't respond. He parked at a distance, studied the angle of the ditch, then stepped out and walked straight to the grain truck without looking at anyone else. The laughter faded slightly, replaced by curiosity. What they didn't see immediately was how he positioned the Holmes. Not beside the truck like the hydraulics had done, but lower on the slope, where the ground was firmer and the pull angle stayed shallow. He anchored the cable to a reinforced rear recovery point inside the frame, the same hidden geometry he had discovered weeks earlier. When he engaged the winch, there was no sudden strain, no hydraulic shift, no sinking outriggers, just steady mechanical pull, and the old wrecker began to move forward without hesitation. The moment the cable tightened, the entire scene changed character. The slack disappeared first, followed by a low metallic hum that ran through the Holmes wrecker's frame like a steady pulse. There was no sudden jerk, no violent strain, no hydraulic hiss or computerized correction. Just controlled mechanical force transferring through steel that had been built to carry more than it was ever originally designed for, and later reinforced by someone who understood exactly what failure looked like under load. The grain truck shifted slightly in the ditch. Not much, just enough to notice. Mud around the rear wheels released a slow, wet suction sound as the tires tried to hold their position. The soil was still collapsing in small increments, but the direction had changed. Instead of sinking deeper, the truck was now resisting upward pull. That resistance told Walt everything he needed to know. The geometry was working. Behind him, one of the modern tow operators muttered, "It's not going to hold that angle." But the sentence never finished properly because the old wrecker's rear wheels began to roll forward. Slowly, deliberately, no spin, no slip, just traction. The reinforced frame absorbed the tension instead of fighting it. The hidden internal plates distributed the load across the chassis, preventing the kind of twist that normally kills older wreckers under heavy strain. The cable stayed low, maintaining a shallow pull angle that turned raw force into movement instead of vertical lift. A second pull tightened the line further. The grain truck lurched again, this time rising several inches as the ditch released its grip. Mud slid off the undercarriage in thick sheets. The sound of it hitting water echoed across the field like collapsing weight. Still, Walt didn't increase throttle aggressively. He kept it steady, almost conservative, letting the machine work within its limits instead of forcing it beyond them. The Holmes wrecker moved another foot forward, then another. The modern wreckers remained parked at the edge of the field, their engines idling but unused. One operator stood near his rig with his arms crossed, watching a machine from 1953 to what 2 modern hydraulic units had failed to even begin. There was no joke anymore, no commentary, just observation. Carl Braddock stood slightly behind them, silent now. The earlier confidence had drained from his posture, replaced by something quieter and harder to name. He had dismissed the truck as scrap. He had laughed at the purchase, And now he was watching that same purchase pull a fully loaded grain truck out of a collapsing ditch without breaking its rhythm. Inside the Holmes wrecker, steel carried the load. Outside, the mud finally gave way. When the grain truck finally rolled onto solid ground, there was no celebration, no shouting, no dramatic finish. Just the sound of rain continuing to fall on a field that had already been changed in a way most of the people standing there didn't yet fully understand. Walt didn't step out of the cab right away. He let the engine idle for a moment, listening to it the way he always did, like it was telling him whether it had been pushed too far or used correctly. The Holmes wrecker wasn't new, and it wasn't restored in the way modern collectors would define restoration. It was something else, something closer to understanding than repair. Around him, the modern wreckers remained still. Their operators were no longer joking. No one needed to explain what they had just seen. The result spoke for itself in a language every tow operator understood: load, tension, movement, failure, success. Carl Braddock stood farther back than before. Not angry anymore, just quiet. The machine he had dismissed as scrap had done something his equipment could not do under the same conditions. But the lesson wasn't about horsepower or hydraulics. It wasn't even about age. It was about design born from necessity instead of theory. Walt finally stepped down from the cab and walked to the front of the truck. He ran his hand lightly along the frame where the hidden reinforcement still sat beneath layers of welded steel. That was the real discovery. Not that the truck was strong, but that someone had once rebuilt it to understand forces modern machines had started to forget. Old machines like this were never simple. They were shaped by operators who didn't have safety margins, software systems, or factory redesigns. They worked in mud, on slopes, in failure conditions where every mistake became mechanical knowledge. And that knowledge stayed embedded in steel long after the people who created it were gone. Walt climbed back into the cab without saying anything to anyone. The engine turned over, steady and familiar, and the old wrecker rolled forward out of the field at a calm, controlled pace. Behind him, the modern rigs remained parked in silence. And as the truck disappeared down the muddy road, it was clear that what had been found in that auction yard was never just a machine. It was a memory of engineering that still knew how to work. Sometimes the value of a machine isn't visible in its paint, price, or parts. It's in the decisions made long ago by someone who understood real work: mud, weight, failure, and force. That knowledge gets buried in steel, forgotten by modern eyes trained to look for efficiency instead of experience. But when the right hands find it again, it still works. Quietly, reliably, without noise or explanation. And in those moments, you realize the truth: some machines are not old. They are simply waiting for someone who still understands what they were built to do.